The Dead Sea Scrolls are often introduced as one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern age. That is true, but it is also not enough. Because the scrolls are more than a discovery. They are an argument that never ended. They are fragments of scripture, community rules, apocalyptic visions, biblical copies, mysterious commentaries, and one copper document that reads more like a treasure map than a religious text. They came out of desert caves near the Dead Sea, but almost every question surrounding them still feels unsettled. Who wrote them? Why were they hidden? What do they change? And why did access to them become so controversial that scholars began speaking about the scrolls almost the way conspiracy hunters speak about sealed archives? The story begins with a scene that sounds almost too perfect to be real. In the late 1940s, near Qumran, a Bedouin shepherd searching for a stray animal is said to have thrown a stone into a cave and heard pottery break. When people finally entered, they found jars and ancient scrolls, some wrapped in linen, some damaged by time, dryness, and neglect. The image is unforgettable: a silent cave, sealed darkness, and texts that had waited nearly 2,000 years to be seen again. It is exactly the kind of beginning that turns scholarship into legend. But the scrolls were never just one cave and never just one text. Over time, multiple caves around Qumran yielded hundreds of manuscripts and thousands of fragments. Some were nearly intact. Many were broken into pieces so small that reconstructing them became an intellectual puzzle stretching across decades. The finds included copies of books that later became part of the Hebrew Bible, texts that did not become canonical, legal writings, hymns, sectarian rules, war texts, commentaries, calendars, and documents that offered a rare look into the diversity of Jewish thought in the Second Temple period. That alone would have guaranteed their importance. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest substantial Hebrew biblical manuscripts were much later than the age in which these Qumran texts were copied. Suddenly scholars had access to witnesses far closer to antiquity. The scrolls did not simply confirm one clean and frozen version of the biblical text. Instead, they showed variation, development, and a living textual world. Some passages matched later traditions closely. Others revealed differences in wording, order, or emphasis. For believers, historians, and textual critics alike, that was electrifying. The scrolls suggested that sacred texts had histories, and that those histories were more complex than many had imagined. This is one reason the Dead Sea Scrolls still divide historians. People do not only argue about what the scrolls say. They argue about what kind of world the scrolls reveal. Do they primarily confirm continuity? Do they reveal fluidity? Do they illuminate early Christianity indirectly? Do they mainly tell us about one isolated Jewish sect? Or do they open a window onto a much wider network of ideas circulating in Judea before the destruction of the Second Temple? Every school of interpretation has something at stake. The first great question is authorship. For decades, one dominant theory held that the scrolls came from a Jewish sect commonly identified with the Essenes, a community living near Qumran with strict rules, ritual discipline, communal practices, and an apocalyptic worldview. And yet it never stayed solved. Other historians challenged the Essene model, arguing that the evidence was less secure than it appeared. They questioned whether Qumran had really been the home of a scribal sect, whether the manuscript collection was too diverse to belong to one group, and whether at least some of the texts could have come from libraries in Jerusalem, hidden in the caves during the Roman advance. If that is true, the scrolls do not represent one isolated community alone. They represent a broader collapse, a desperate act of preservation during war. The difference is enormous. In one version, the scrolls are the library of a sect. In the other, they are the emergency memory of a civilization under threat. That uncertainty reaches into almost every major theme. Consider the so-called community rule, one of the most discussed sectarian texts. It seems to describe admission rituals, ranks, punishments, property rules, and a moral worldview built on absolute division between the righteous and the wicked. Many readers see it as the backbone of the Qumran sect. But how representative is it of the whole collection? Was it central or one voice among many? Historians still disagree, because the scrolls do not hand us a simple archive catalog with clear labels. They hand us fragments, patterns, probabilities, and room for competing reconstructions. Then there is the War Scroll, another text that helped make the discovery feel dramatic. It imagines an apocalyptic conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, with ritual, order, and divine judgment shaping the battle. Even readers with no background in ancient Judaism can sense how explosive that is. This is not dry administration. It is a worldview burning with expectation. It shows that before Christianity emerged as a distinct movement, the religious atmosphere of the region already contained intense hopes for final confrontation, purification, and cosmic reversal. That matters because it complicates lazy historical narratives. The world around the birth of Christianity was not calm or intellectually uniform. It was charged. And once historians realized how charged it was, a second argument began: how close were some of these Qumran ideas to ideas that later appear in Christianity? The scrolls do not mention Jesus. They do not function as a hidden Christian archive. But they do reveal a world filled with messianic expectation, symbolic readings of scripture, ritual communities, eschatological tension, and arguments over purity and law. For some scholars, that makes the scrolls essential background, not because they prove anything simplistic, but because they remind us that Christianity emerged from a very crowded religious landscape. For others, public fascination has exaggerated those connections. That tension between scholarly caution and popular excitement has followed the scrolls for decades. No discussion of the Dead Sea Scrolls can avoid the Copper Scroll. If the rest of the collection feels ancient, sacred, and fragile, the Copper Scroll feels almost cinematic. Unlike the parchment and papyrus texts, it was inscribed on copper and had to be cut open for reading. Instead of community regulations or biblical passages, it lists locations and quantities of hidden treasures in astonishing detail. Gold, silver, offerings, temple wealth, caches buried or concealed in specified places. The tone is practical, almost administrative, and that is exactly what makes it disturbing. If it is symbolic, it is strangely concrete. If it is literal, then it describes one of the most tantalizing lost treasure records in antiquity. Historians still argue over what to do with it. Some see the Copper Scroll as a genuine record connected to temple treasure hidden before the Roman destruction. Others think it may be legendary, idealized, or connected to a community tradition that was never meant to guide literal recovery. Treasure hunters love it because it sounds actionable. Scholars fear overstatement because the text has never led to a definitive recovery of the vast riches it seems to describe. That unresolved status keeps it alive. The Copper Scroll turns the entire Dead Sea Scroll story from textual criticism into something stranger, a place where biblical scholarship, archaeology, myth, and treasure lore all collide. Then there is the question of secrecy, and this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls became more than an archaeological subject. For years after the initial discoveries, access to large portions of the material was limited to a relatively small editorial team. Publication moved slowly. Photographs were not widely accessible. Scholars outside the inner circle complained that a discovery of global significance was being effectively monopolized. Suspicion grew. Were the delays ordinary academic caution? Were the fragments simply difficult to reconstruct? Or were there institutional, political, or religious reasons that some texts were not being released quickly? This controversy did real damage to trust. Once the public hears that ancient texts of enormous importance exist, but only a small number of experts can see them, the conspiracy machinery starts instantly. People begin imagining suppressed evidence, hidden gospels, scandalous doctrines, dangerous contradictions, and proofs too disruptive to publish. In reality, much of the delay appears to have been explained by the sheer complexity of the material and the structure of academic control. But the social effect was already locked in. The scrolls had acquired an aura of managed knowledge. That aura intensified because the scrolls were not just ancient. They were fragile, prestigious, and politically charged. Control over fragments meant control over publication, interpretation, reputation, and academic power. Entire careers could be built on tiny pieces of parchment. In that environment, rivalry was inevitable. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls became a story about scholars as much as scribes, about who gets to name the meaning of a text once it enters modern hands. Modern forgery controversies added yet another layer. In recent years, some fragments acquired by institutions outside the main Qumran corpus were later judged likely to be modern fakes. That did not discredit the original Dead Sea Scrolls collection, which remains one of the great authenticated discoveries of ancient history. But it reminded the public of something uncomfortable. Whenever an ancient text becomes world-famous, money, prestige, and ideology gather around it. And where those forces gather, forgery follows. That makes careful scholarship even more important, but it also makes public trust harder to maintain. Another reason historians still fight over the scrolls is that they resist clean ownership. Are they primarily a Jewish heritage discovery? A global heritage discovery. A site bound up with the history of the modern Middle East. A textual treasure claimed through archaeology, religion, national memory, museum politics, and international scholarship all at once. The scrolls exist at the intersection of ancient history and modern conflict. That means every argument about custody, display, interpretation, and identity can become politically charged. Yet beneath all of this argument sits a simpler and more haunting fact. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved voices that were never supposed to survive this way. Communities vanish. Temples burn. Empires advance. Languages shift. Libraries are scattered. Usually history leaves behind summaries written by the winners or later interpreters. But the scrolls feel different because they bring us closer to internal voices, internal anxieties, internal discipline, and internal hope. They do not remove the need for interpretation, but they narrow the distance. That is why people speak about them with such intensity. They feel intimate. And intimacy changes the stakes. If the scrolls were only another set of ruins, they would matter to specialists. But because they touch scripture, identity, origins, and the religious atmosphere of late Second Temple Judaism, they matter to everyone who wonders how traditions form. They force us to think about the difference between sacred text and textual history. They force us to ask how communities decide what belongs inside Revelation and what remains outside it. They force us to admit that the ancient world was not built from one single voice descending intact into the present. It was built from contest, copying, memory, and selection. So why do the Dead Sea Scrolls still divide historians? Because they sit at the exact point where evidence becomes meaning. The fragments themselves are real. The caves are real. The age of the manuscripts is real. But the story those fragments tell is still incomplete. They can be used to support broader models or narrower ones, radical claims or cautious ones, sectarian readings or civilizational readings. Each new reconstruction clarifies one part of the puzzle and throws another part into shadow. That is what makes the scrolls feel dark in the shadow archive sense. Not dark because they are evil, but dark because they illuminate the edges of what we still do not know. A shepherd's stone, a broken jar, a cave in the desert, and suddenly the last 2,000 years of textual certainty feel more fragile. A copper inventory hints at buried wealth no one can confidently recover. Publication delays create suspicion. Sectarian rules suggest a community obsessed with purity and final judgment. And every answer opens another question. Maybe that is the real legacy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They did not simply give us lost texts. They gave us a better picture of how unstable the past really is. They showed that the religious world before the destruction of the Second Temple was crowded, disputed, imaginative, and alive. They showed that Scripture itself moved through history as text, copy, variation, and interpretation. They showed that one cave can disturb an entire civilization's confidence in how neatly its story was preserved. And that is why the scrolls still divide historians. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the evidence is strong enough to matter and incomplete enough to argue over forever. Subscribe to Shadow Archive for more dark history documentaries.